Hello, friends. Welcome to the Center for Global Studies video logs that we're beginning to start with. And for starters, we have today Dr. Florian Kühn of the University of Gothenburg, Sweden, with a regional focus on Afghanistan and the whole West and Central Asian region, as well as the Middle East. And he has contributed to the debate about the liberal peace, international relations, and problems and inherent contradictions of peace building and state building processes that we actually now see at play in Afghanistan. He has had generally a focus on the political economy of conflicts, and a long-standing interest in rentier state politics comes with that. And he has looked at the illicit activities of state and non-state group advancing their political positions, in particular the violent groups outside of the official positions of power. Dr. Kühn is also a co-editor of the Journal of Intervention and State Building, which, because he's a friend, I can say is coming under a little bit of scrutiny after what's going on in Afghanistan. So, Dr. Kühn, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Kühn, let's begin with the obvious question. What would be the obvious question now? You know, you've been engaged with Afghanistan since Taliban, the first Taliban regime was toppled in 2001. Did you anticipate the rapidity with which 2 decades of attempts at state building virtually melted into air?
Well, I don't think seriously anybody really expected it to be so fast that a lot of the structures of the state would be unraveling over a maybe longer period of time was very much expected, and is also the result of many years of research. I've been reminded by a journalist recently that about an interview that I gave following a book that I've published with a colleague in 2010, which is called Illusion State Building, where we basically argue that the international interventions create what we've called a Potemkin village, which is basically a village consisting of facades to pretend there is a state. But what we're arguing is that behind the facade, there is a void, and the void is really the connection between state institutions and society. And this is something that we have observed in different countries, but particularly in the rentier state situation of Afghanistan, where many of the institutions were kept alive by international advisors, and a lot of the political life took place in Kabul. But beyond that, there was relatively little reach, true reach into society of state institutions. None of the internationally involved countries, donors, supporting agencies managed to establish this link very clearly. So it was to be expected that the lack of embeddedness of the state in society was going to turn out to be a problem. That the Taliban actually moved in a very strategic way for about half a year, 3/4 of a year, starting in autumn of 2020, to control the roads, then starting to control the countrysides in different provinces, and then clockwise encircling Kabul was in fact something that was to be observed much earlier. So that eventually they were going to go for Kabul was something to be expected. And then it is quite surprising that the international intelligence community didn't expect it to happen as quickly as it did in the end. I expected at least 2 weeks before Kabul fell that Kabul was next on the list, particularly informed by the rapid fall of other major cities. So my expectations at the outset was that there would be a fight for Herat, that there would be a fight for Masar. All this didn't happen, so there was a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which then led to different units not trying to resist the Taliban, Taliban advances, because they were basically assuming that the Taliban would win it anyway. So as a historical note, since I'm speaking to a historian here, and I'm not a historian, it is not unheard of in Afghan history that that different groups and different militias would practically constantly weigh their bets and shift sides if they felt it was in their own interest. And this seems to have happened again in a way that really advanced the rapid progress of the Taliban taking the country. My suspicion is, and here I'm speculating, that the Taliban were a bit surprised at how quick this actually unfolded.
Yeah, they have nearly said as much, that even they did not anticipate that the success was going to be this rapid. But during your visits to Afghanistan, during the 20 years that went in between, did you have a sense of the Taliban actually gaining in popularity? I understand the fact that the countryside was seldom penetrated by people from outside, but the impression that one gains seems to have is that the Taliban actually has some popularity, or is it the unpopularity of the international forces and the kind of ham-handed manner in which very frequently they dealt with local problems? Are these interchangeable categories? I mean, does the popularity of Taliban increase with the unpopularity of the United States and the NATO forces? Or how would you look at this?
In principle, I would say a lot of the popularity, as you put it, or the support for the Taliban emanated from a dislike for the Western intervention, not necessarily the Americans, even though the US military was fighting at the front line and that's something that's easy to say, as I've said this throughout the whole mission, were victimizing many Afghans, were basically not regarding politics and culture in a way that would have been sensible, despite all the talk about winning hearts and minds and counterinsurgency and all that. All that were empty shells, conceptually speaking, for not knowing what to do militarily in a country where military success was impossible to actually measure or even to conceptualize. So there was a lot of politics replaced by violence, which of course did not help bring a clear message what all this was about to the Afghan population. Of course, this situation where it was very difficult to agree to the state building project for most made it much easier for many in the opposition, and now it seems that the Taliban have emerged as the strongest and likely most popular of those groups. But there are many other groups in Afghanistan who resisted the state building project as well, from landowners to what is misleadingly called warlords, etc., were not entirely on the page. So what we're talking about here, and this I think we need to remind ourselves of, is that the people that the Western intervention worked with were actually Islamists as well. They weren't necessarily supporting a liberal state building project, but they were supporting being in power and collecting a lot of money that they received from outside donors. So in a sense, the dislike for the intervention, the suspicion that there was not the suspicion that it was a certainty that corruption was rampant in, at levels unheard of before, the riches that many people accumulated for themselves privately from funds that were actually indicated to be for a broader public use, etc., really delegitimized the state building project and its local elites. So in a sense, it's a mixture, as you've suggested. It's a mixture of both. There's of course some support for what the Taliban stand for, which in fact is Afghan nationalism. It is the clear position that the Taliban had from the beginning, and they have never changed that position, that Afghanistan should be ruled by Afghans and not some outsiders or their dependent stooges or marionettes, as they've put it. So really, it is a kind of, from their perspective, it is a kind of a resistance movement with all the strings attached in terms of honor and defending the country and all that, which gives legitimacy to the Taliban. So not everybody who supports the Taliban in this quest is actually supporting their ideas about how society should be governed.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point that you raised. So you would say, by and large, that whether you're Taliban or not, the component of Islam in Afghan politics is reasonably great. So would you say that Islam is a genuine factor in Taliban's popularity? Their particularly conservative traditional reading of Islam is a genuine factor? And would you say that it is more like a Pashtun traditionalism masquerading behind the guise of Islam? What is your understanding of the ground situation?
In fact, I think it's neither nor. It's not only, the Taliban are not a Pashtun movement, at least no longer. They have a Pashtun core, but the Taliban were relatively, and that dates back a long time. The Taliban were relatively happy if other members from other ethnic groups actually joined them. So the Taliban were never an exclusively Pashtun movement. They've now indicated that they're kind of relying on a core Pashtun-dominated administration, as we see in the new government that they've built. But that's more really about rewarding people who have long-standing ties to the inner core of the Taliban movement when they started in the 1990s. So there's a lot of questions of loyalty going on. There's a number of questions of trust against different persons. Plus, there's a certain there's a struggle within the Taliban to preserve their ideological and you know, the core of what they stand for. So the Taliban are trying to preserve their inner core in terms of societal ideas. Because currently what we see is that there is a lot of tensions within the Taliban, and that was something to be expected as well, because a resistance movement is always very coherent and has a lot of cohesion when they're in opposition to what is there. But now they're in a situation where they need to define what they want and what they stand for, and that's going to cause internal ruptures as well. As an additional point, there is a number of fighters who now want to get their reward. And that's, of course, we know that from other conflicts. It's a huge problem for resistance movements who suddenly gain power or who suddenly are in control, that they need to find a balance between those who didn't support them and those who did sacrifice a lot to support them, to get the balance right between rewards and punishment, so to speak. Because the Taliban currently don't seem to be in control as much as they would like to be. They're certainly not as much in control as they were in the late 1990s. So it may turn out that they are facing resistance from different sides, even though they've now taken over Panjshir nominally. But whether that's just a temporary victory remains to be seen. So summarizing all that, my assumption is that the Taliban's best day was on August 15 or maybe August 31st, when they actually managed that the Americans leave. After that, trouble begins.
I agree with you entirely. Well, it's either the beginning of the end or end of the beginning. We are certainly nowhere close to the end. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Thank you so much, Dr. Kühn, for your time. It was wonderful having you.
Very welcome.